All right, let's see. I'm going to give it a few more minutes and I'm going to switch it over to Facebook Live. So I'm going to let people know it's here on Facebook instead of on YouTube. All right, hopefully you guys can hear me. Hi, Innie. And hopefully I can, or you're seeing my slide deck. I'll give it one more minute. If you want to let people know that are on Facebook or on YouTube or things like that, I'll send the link over to YouTube as well. All right. Great, thanks. All right, let's get started. And hopefully people will join us or answer questions or ask questions, answer them, whatever, add comments. Sorry for the hiccup, the technical details. I will begin the slideshow. So anyways, this is Chris Lee for reveal.org. I've been following the International Church of Christ, International Christian Churches, for about 30 years. And I am very apologetic. This is not going to be exhaustive. There are many leaders who left, many people who realized problems, many former evangelists, such as in Budapest, Berlin, Athens. I'm not going to cover every church plan. I'm not going to cover every runaway church or splinter, runaway house church, Bible talk, not every book that was written, every pamphlet or material that has been written. But I do promise both a deeper dive into many of the eras. So we'll dive into the mainline churches of Christ, into the Crossroads era, into the early phases of the Boston movement, the International Church of Christ, and then the International Christian Churches. And also, this should be the first of hopefully many presentations and podcasts that I'll put together in terms of helping people understand what this is about and what some of the beliefs are, what are some of the distinctives, what are some of the problems. Hopefully it will be helpful in terms of recovery as well. And for today, I plan to stick to just history as opposed to really diving into what is their doctrine. And hopefully I'll do this in an hour or less. There's kind of two major things that I plan to do is kind of one is answer what is the importance of factual history, and second thing is look at themes such as in the ICOC and the ICC, and especially how certain persons have responded to, say, accusations or criticism. And for bonus, there's a GRE word, fancy word at the end. So look for that. I know it may be a little bit confusing at first in terms of all like the terminology, you know, Crossroads, Boston Movement, Boston Church of Christ, International Church of Christ, International Christian Churches, or ICOC and ICC. So maybe I'll spend like 30 seconds talking about that. So as we begin, it will be primarily the Crossroads era, even though it was the 14th Street Church of Christ, and then it was only named Crossroads after they moved buildings, but that's kind of the common terminology. And then when Kip went up to Lexington in the Boston metro area, it was later dubbed the Boston Church of Christ, and then because a lot of churches were planted out of there and reconstructed other churches. It was the Boston movement. And then it was only named the International Churches of Christ in 1993, but we'll still kind of review everything from 1979 under that umbrella of the International Churches of Christ. And then finally in 2006, the establishment of the International Christian Churches. So ICOC, whenever you see that, that'll be International Christian Churches of Christ. ICC is the 2006 movement, International Christian Churches. So my first slide of content is to kind of look at the bigger picture of what is going on in Christianity for two reasons. One is, as it said, when the tide comes in, all boats are buoyed up. And what we talk about awakenings in Christendom, these tend to cross denominational lines and also country lines. So, for instance, in the Great Awakening that happened primarily in Great Britain and in the United States, regardless of denomination, there was an interest in Christianity. Young people by the droves wanted to hear pastors speak in churches. Jonathan Edwards talks a lot about this. So even though I know the ICOC and ICC don't consider the rest of the world Christians, that, I think Christian sociologists want to say, regardless of denominational lines or regardless of where you stand on these things, that there is a spiritual interest. And so this is in the middle of the Fourth Great Awakening, which is also called the Jesus Movement. And that within that, so over on the evangelical Protestant side, we have parachurch organizations such as the Navigators, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, the IFES, the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students, and Crusade, which is now, or Campus Crusade for Christ, which is now Cru, that have been established prior to this time frame. And in fact, there were some of these people who were invited by Crossroads to speak on their different organizational abilities and also tactics. So for instance, Bill Bright was invited to speak at the first campus evangelism seminar in 1966. And Lucas also learned to hold events like some of these, like Navigators and Cru in hotels. So Crossroads certainly based some of their methodology in that. So within the mainline churches of Christ, and I'll take a little rabbit trail here, which is deemed lukewarm for some reason by Kip, which I think is the first indication that it's a bit of jargon. If you go against the ICOC or ICC, you're deemed lukewarm. But they had a number of evangelistic options as well, a lot of outreach. So for example, the International Soul Winning Workshops, a guy named Marvin Phillips was in charge of that. Bible chairs that were established at universities, campus ministries and campus ministers, certainly the 1966 Campus Evangelism Seminar that I mentioned, and then an international campus evangelism seminar in 1968. So even prior to a lot of the Crossroads efforts, there is a strong emphasis within the mainline churches of Christ to evangelize. So that's important to recognize. And then, so now we dive into our story. In 1967, the mentor for Kip McKean, a man named Chuck Lucas, was hired by the elders of the 14th Street Church of Christ. And this was later renamed Crossroads in 1973 upon moving to a different building. And he was sent off to the University of Florida and was very successful. He created a program called Campus Advance. Within this early time frame, Argentinian pastor named Juan Carlos Ortiz came, and he was very successful in his shepherding tactics, and he spoke with a number of people, including what is now known as the Fort Lauderdale Five, like Bob Mumford and others, Vern Baxter, I believe. And even there's a connection between Bob Wiener of Maranatha and Chuck Lucas. So over this time, Chuck had two main distinctives. One is that, of course, he called it evangelism. Evangelism was not optional. It was mandatory. And so, but it was really recruitment. You're supposed to go and find more people to join. Um, that every person, every disciple is to be a fisher of men. And then what was later called discipling. So as you can imagine, when people become Christians, they might be led by the Holy Spirit to do different things. Maybe somebody is like, "Oh, I'm really involved with biotech, and I want to move to Duke University to do that." Or maybe somebody else is like, "Yeah, I want to get more involved with high tech, so I'm going to the Bay Area." And so, with people going different directions, your people tend to scatter. But instead, if you can find a way to tie them back into the system, and initially that was with prayer partners and later discipling partners, then you can maintain and grow your church. Kip then joined in 1972, as he describes in his own chronicles. So, uh, why this is also important in terms of calling it Crossroads is that many of the campus ministers in Boston, in the Boston movement, leadership, as well as those who align themselves in the Boston movement churches, originated at Crossroads. So, and one more word about this is that it started as a very dynamic movement. So, people maybe at the University of Florida would meet together, and from my early accounts, I've heard it said that people were just like, "Oh, I feel like we should just pray right now," or "I'd like to study the Bible more." So it was much more dynamic. But as time progressed, there was increasing control, reporting of numbers, institutionalizing of certain practices, such as dating, and who you had to get advice on this matter, and the number of people that had to be, a minimum was not two, as in the couple, it was more than that. So, anyways, that that's kind of the early part of the Crossroads era here. Uh, so here we have Kip McKean coming into the scene, and as I mentioned the last slide, he was converted in 1972, and then as he completed his college, he went off. He was first sent to Northern Christian College in Philadelphia for 10 months, and he described it as very painful, but it was a flop, and everybody else knew about it. And then later he was sent to the Eastern Illinois University Campus Ministry under the guidance of the Heritage Chapel Church of Christ. And already within that time frame, so over the next few years, he continued as campus minister. But even within a year, you can see that, there's these documents that I have from the Heritage Chapel Church of Christ that they felt that there was a lot of push towards numbers, the idolatry of recruitment, heavy-handedness, legalism, emotionalism, elitism. They felt that they were superior to the rest of the mainline churches of Christ, and cults around certain personalities. They tended to esteem Chuck Lucas and Kip McKean very highly. And so they actually, in 1977, as it is typical that campus ministers need to have funding. College students are relatively poor, so usually a church will fund them, and that kind of says like they're legitimate, they're our people, we want them to continue. And this is known as support. And so if a church says, yeah, we don't believe in continuing support, that means, yeah, we're firing that person. So uh, Kip was fired from the campus ministry, even though he continued. Guess he found other students or maybe alumni to support him for a couple of years. And because it was so successful in terms of numbers, he did grow it to several hundred, that he continued to tour around the US to speak about his radical Christianity. All right. Then we shift in 1979, a church that was closing. It was 30 people and about to close its doors. The Lexington Church of Christ in Lexington, Massachusetts, decided to go find Kip and ask him to be both their senior minister and campus minister. So he talks about this in terms of June 1979. And that there's the living room of the Gempels and in as of today, 45 years. These 30 would-be disciples sat down and spoke about what they wanted to do. So uh, it then went over, and I guess Al Baird was actually at the nearby Burlington Church of Christ, so that's the next door neighbor, and they merged. I guess they added. Um, and then, as I've indicated with the bulletins here, as of August, you can tell exactly the week that it happened. As of August 1983, it became known as the Boston Church of Christ after expanding. So in any case, that's the early time period. So I have here, Kip, of course, says, oh, in 1980, I established First Principles. And, we can put a little caveat on that. There was actually a mainline Churches of Christ document called First Principles, which he heavily borrows from and has a lot of the same scriptures, has a lot of the same studies, and even Kip's brother, Randy McKean, recognized it. And then in 1981, Kip introduced the concept of pillar churches, like large metropolises where he was going to go plant. So as you can tell, he starts planting these things. He goes to Chicago and sends the Fuquays. London was the Arthurs and the Lloyds. And then he has the first World Mission Seminar. Then the next year, 1983, Boston plants New York with Steve and Lisa Johnson, and we'll talk about them later. Little note for that. And then 1985, Toronto is planted. So now it's in 3 countries. And in the same year, Chuck Lucas was eventually fired from Crossroads, where I think the official term was recurring sins, but it was unrepentant sexual sins. He had had a number of inappropriate relations with some of his interns. So I think it's important to note that they're beginning to grow, and in this time frame, they actually go invite Flavel Yeakley Jr. to go study them. They're very excited about their exponential growth, and they go out and they talk about they want him to go study them, and I think they wanted to be a model for the rest of the mainline Church of Christ. So we'll actually pick up Flavel Yeakley's book in about 2 slides. So with all these, there's in the next few years after that, there's both plantings and reconstruction. So plantings they sent to these cities: Johannesburg, Paris, Stockholm, Mumbai, Mexico, Hong Kong, Munich, and Cairo. And reconstructions are not just hostile takeovers. So what they would do is they go up to a mainline Church of Christ, and they'd say, "Hey, it looks like you're either failing, or we can help you grow much more quickly. So what we'll do is we'll put in our Boston trained leaders, and we'll take your leaders and we'll fly them to Boston. We'll train them there in our methodology, and it'll be a win-win for everybody." And of course, it sounded very appealing for everybody involved, but it's not just everybody who wanted to go. So only the sharp were moved to Boston, not emotionally needy people. So this is much like the deportation. You'll remember in the Assyrian and the Babylonian times, this is 8th century and 7th century BC, that only the movers and shakers, the aristocracy, the upper class, the very educated, basically anybody who had high influence was deported. It was not everybody. They didn't want homeless people, for example, included in the Boston movement reconstructions. So this is what it is. So already I'm going to go a slight aside. There's certain leaders who are exhibiting behaviors that are more like non-Christians, or we say the unregenerate. Anyway, so at this time, also special missions contribution is introduced. I know there was a question about pillar churches, but that's from Kip's own writings that he introduces pillar churches in 1981. All right. So as we've talked about, they're heavily into growth, and with I think Jerry Jones has the comment that it's like he Kip often legitimized this movement as being blessed with God because of all of the growth, and it was the fastest or one of the fastest growing churches. And so Jerry has this phrase like the movement became the message and the momentum became the motivation. So they were not just telling people to come to Jesus or come to God. It was, join the Boston movement. And, why is it blessed by God? Well, that's because we have so many conversions. And I've taken Andy Fleming's paper, Let Each One Who Builds, or Each One Be Careful How He Builds, and just massage the statistics a bit. He doesn't look as much on these things. So, the first graph on the left, all I did was I looked at, instead of talking about the number of people that you have and the number of former members, total former members and total membership, let's talk about the growth in membership and the growth in number of former members. So, already you can see by several points that the growth of former members is far outpacing the membership. And in fact, if you look at the right side, which is total membership versus total former members by 1991, there's actually more former members, and they're growing at a much faster pace. So, unfortunately, if you use the phrase like, oh yes, we must be blessed by God and because we have all these people coming to us, well, I guess the former member base is really, really blessed by God or something like that, which is kind of weird. But anyways, um, so this is kind of the dark side of the numbers. You can certainly do some analysis and figure out what's going on. I've actually got a my own stuff that I'll dive into when we get to this point in terms of like, we can see certain inflection points and talk about what happened in like 1987 or in 1994, things like that. Anyways, so now you begin to have problems as I've alluded to by 1986, 87. So 7 years, 8 years into the start of the Boston movement, these are pretty pretty significant people. So, for example, Dr. Jerry Jones, he's their main theologian. And I've used this bold highlight yellow color to indicate that these are more critical or, more not so positive towards the ICOC or ICC publications. So anyways, as I mentioned before, so Flavel Yeakley Jr. was the director of church growth studies at Abilene Christian University, and he was approached in the mid early 80s, and Al Baird and others were really thrilled at how the Boston Church of Christ was growing so fast, the Boston movement. And what they didn't realize was that, yes, Yeakley did study these growth patterns, but he also studied deviant groups such as the Way International and Maranatha, which is also Every Nation or Tree of Life, Children of God, Sun Myung Moon's Unification Church, Scientology, Hare Krishnas. And he noted that with the deviant groups, that there was a shift in personality, especially the more lengthy the stay within the group, the longer the person had been a member. And it sure, Myers-Briggs will say is an imperfect instrument, but it's interesting to think about, even as imperfect as that instrument is, that he saw shifts, Yeakley saw shifts towards a group norm or towards a desired personality. And so, yes, Yeakley was, of course, quite thrilled with their success and wanted to congratulate their growth, but he was also highly cautious in terms of that this resembled, the Boston movement resembled one of these deviant groups, and that wholesale manufacture and falsification of personalities is not healthy long term. That is, if you're getting pushed towards an ENFJ or ESFJ across any organization, this is not going to be good for you. I'm an introvert. I need my quiet time sometimes and alone time. I'm a borderline introvert, but that's certainly not sinful to be those things. So anyways, as well, there's continued criticism within the mainline churches of Christ in this, 87 time frame. A number of pamphlets and books were written. Jerry Jones actually started to send out letters, and this is actually why he started compiling What Does the Boston Movement Teach? So people were very curious. He's like, well, what exactly is going on? What is it that we're being involved with? Because the Crossroads people and the Boston movement people were coming out and trying to take over more of the churches. There were actually some schisms that happened. So, for instance, within the old Crossroads, Joe Woods and his crew went to Boston, and then the remaining people decided not to go with Boston, and so they actually hired back somebody like Denny Shepard to help deal with everything. And also, I think, you mentioned you were here in, or you might have been aware of this. There's another person that we're going to talk with, and in that particular podcast on the Crossroads that was not part of the Boston movement. She was in Crossroads and then was in Atlanta, and then there was, a schism that formed within Atlanta where I think a number of them did eventually want to go with the Boston movement, and unfortunately had some negative repercussions. So, anyways, at this time in 1987, Kip actually decides to change the doctrine. He goes, "Oh, why have we been so weak?" So, at this perfectly united 1987 Women's Conference, which I have the transcript for here, you're welcome to steal all my materials and copy and whatever else. Look it up for yourself. That Kip decides, oh, you know what? In Matthew 28:18 through 20, it says, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them and teaching them. Well, who's them? And he goes, well, it's disciples. So we failed in terms of understanding this before, but no, it's that we need to baptize disciples. So people need to make the decision to be a disciple before they're baptized, and that's why they're so weak. So that's an interesting pivot in 1987. So, anyways, uh, in the next number of years, we see continued more of the same. Let's just say more churches are planted out of the Boston movement. There's more reconstructions, more criticism. Certainly, as I alluded to, the What Does the Boston Movement Teach volumes 1 through 3 were published. I have all those. I've scanned in them a number of years ago, and hopefully I'm throwing it into optical character recognition so that it's easier to follow in Google Documents. But right now they're in PDFs, which aren't easy. Yes, there's also an audio in the early 1990s from Jerry Jones and Cal Degg. So how does Kip respond to all this criticism? Well, he goes, it's not me that they don't like, or that they hated the dreamer. It's not the message, it's that they hate Jesus, and so Kip all the time is like, well, they just don't really like Jesus' message, and of course that's kind of conflating. I hope you can see that it's conflating both what Kip uh, interprets the Bible to mean and the program that he has. But anyways, it's never, Kip does not say ever, oh, it's, I've been heavy-handed or harsh in all the programs that I've run or things like that. We could be more gracious and teach more grace. No, it's not the methodology. It's just that largely he goes, oh, they must hate Jesus' message or they hate the dreamer. Anyways, Kip decides to move from Boston to Los Angeles in 1990, where that's the new headquarters of the church. And in this time frame, he does choose world sectors and world sector leadership couples, which is interesting. From one of the former world sector leaders that I talked to, he goes, "Oh, now we have the cardinals. So if we have the cardinals, who's the Pope? Well, Kip." And we have this nice structure, which I'll show in the next slide. And then also in 1991, Hope Worldwide is established, the benevolent arm of the church, which Pat and Bob Gempel end up running. So this is from 1989 to 2001-ish. This was definitely the case where there's I think Marilyn Crete and others, Austin Knoll, were joking around and talking about top leader. So top leader is, yeah, the head guy in charge. He's effectively the Pope, the World Missions Evangelist and Women's Counselor. Uh, that used to be Kip and Elena McKean, and then you had the world sector leaders, and then the cardinals, and then you have the archbishops and the bishops and everything else. Well, no, sorry, this is not the Catholic Church. This is the International Church of Christ. So yes, they have their sector leaders and the evangelists and so on and so forth. So it's definitely a pyramidal structure. And of course, Kip continues to maybe say bad things about critics, saying, well, uh, it's spiritually dead in the rest of the world. So, anyways, in 1992, there's a pretty significant development, as I mentioned, that the International Church of Christ is coined by John Vaughan, and then also this is also where Time starts taking a notice. They publish their article, Keepers of the Flock. It's not incredibly positive. And of course, at the same time, Kip publishes Revolution Through Restoration. There's also, I think this was kind of staggered. In Boston, it was 1992 summer, and in other cities, it was through the rest of 1993. So because the International Church of Christ wasn't growing very fast, they accused that there was sin in the camp. Very common theme. And so they would sit down with every disciple and say, hey, where's your heart at? And are you really committed? And are you giving enough? And then are you, evangelistic? And who did you bring in the last year? And things like that. So those were called heart talks. And these were held, and, some number of people actually had to be restored. They were booted off the membership roll, and had to go through repentance uh, to do that, to become a member again. All right. So in 1993, we have a new world sector leader established, La Media, under L. and Gloria Baird. The Blackwells headed up the world sector, the Middle East world sector, sorry. And then the Milan mission team was disfellowshipped. You can see that story. I think the Cranocks were part of that. For disobedience and also questioning finances. So again, beginning to be more widespread dissent. There was a sin list, and I'm sure you've seen copies of it. I have it in the middle of Toxic Christianity here by Mr. X, but you can find copies of it. And these sin lists are not just like, okay, this person was greedy or stole things, or suffered from whatever thoughts, but they were unusual. It was like, oh, this person is fat, or this person feels, or has struggles with these types of sexual sins or things like that. And it was pretty explicit, and they were distributed to leaders. But the public, including places like Fifth Edition, the British Broadcasting Company 2020, got copies of it. And in different programs, they actually asked Albert, who became the ICOC spokesperson, hey, have you seen this? And of course, every time he was like, no, there's no such thing. And then they'd show him this sin list, and it's like, oh, yes, we passed it around. And it was mostly in terms of leaders trying to help members. So, why the deception? Anyways, so more of the same, more plantings, criticisms, reconstructions done in 1993. There's continued criticism, and by this time, there's beginning to be expulsion of various campuses. I have a list of various universities that have tossed the ICOC. And of course, Mr. X, who is the editor of Discipleship Magazine, or one of the editors and a longtime member since the Crossroads, leaves in 1993 and authored Toxic Christianity, which I have on Reveal. And that's very thorough. It's like 350 something or odd pages. And he takes a lot of the same approach. You can think of it as like, what does the Boston movement teach? But part 4. So anyways, that has a lot of stuff from sin list to criticism and articles that have been written over the years and analyses on doctrine. So in 1994, in the ICOC side, they have this evangelism proclamation, and I think that they've already been on this plan. They were trying to plant one church in every nation in a city of more than 100,000 people. So that was, their big, we're going to do this by 2000. Uh, and then Kip McKean writes Revolution Through Restoration 2. There's the first World Leadership Conference, and it's held in Manila, which is the first time that it's held outside of the US. And also in this time frame, the Indianapolis church, uh, under Ed Powers, they raised 4 points. So Ed had initially not wanted to split the church. He came to these conclusions and he was planning to resign. But he talked with a couple other leadership couples and he said, these are my concerns. And they agreed. So then they presented it to the staff. And the staff also said, yeah, we have problems too, and we're on board with this. So then they said, okay, fine. Um, you know, we'd like to talk with the church about this. So then they gave the, you'll see unity or uniformity is the name of the talk. And they said things like policy and doctrine, things like, how much we should give and, where we should plant should not be dictated by Los Angeles. And they also felt that it was too exclusivistic. They said, well, certainly we think there are other Christians out there, and it's not just those who belong to the International Church of Christ, that giving should not be done under compulsion. And that's a theme that Colton Rowan also picks up about 20 years later, 19 years later, 18 years later. And that the legalistic system, things such as monitored tithings, enforced missions contribution, all the poring over statistics is robbing people of their joy. And the church actually votes overwhelmingly to split off. And of course, this is called Sodom and Gomorrah by Kip and Marty Fuqua later. But it's a pretty significant point. Also, alt religion Christian Boston Church Usenet group came, and it's also an important thing because I think prior to this, the International Church of Christ would largely say things like, well, all the churches are individual, or autonomous. They used it whenever it suited them. Yeah, that's why you only get minor abuses under this leader or that leader. And also they were able to wave away a lot of the criticisms and ignore them. They only tended to be run by certain papers or in certain camps with certain pamphlets. And the internet actually was the first vehicle to really show us that wherever this church goes, there's a lot of problems that follow. There's a lot of themes. In 1995, there's the first recognition. Al Baird gives the shepherding crisis talk at this Johannesburg World Missions Leadership Conference, that for every 3 that join, 2 leave. Of course, Canon is launches at this time. Reveal launched at this time. The ICOC actually had the site icoc.org, but now it's over at Disciples Today. There's actually a group of people who left in 1997 out of Nairobi, and legalism was mentioned. And then in 2000, the ICOC announced the success. They were able to meet their goal of establishing a church in every city in the world of more than 100,000. David and Natasha Madrano left. They were the lead evangelist and women's counselor in Madrid and Lisbon. And they mentioned authoritarianism and legalism, obsession with numbers, exclusivism. I mentioned this story mostly like this is another leader who has repeated the themes that have gone on for more than a decade. And then in 2001, as you know, there was this announcement. The first link here is actually Kip announcing that they're going to take a sabbatical. And then the second is it's from Web Archive, but it's from Upside or Down, which was another ICOC website that Al Baird responded and said, yes, in fact, Kip is going to take a sabbatical. And then there was a resignation speech that Kip gave in 2002, finally. So with all this, there's also some town halls at this time. Those of us who were working in like the 2001, 2000, 2002 timeframe know this time is like the dot-com bust, or there was a recession at the time, and there was some grumbling. Certainly, a lot of people were beginning to ask questions like, where did the money for the special missions contribution in Boston go? what risky investments did you take? So there were a number of town halls that were beginning to pop up uh, in this time to address some of the concerns. I know that after the next major event in 2003, there were a lot more town halls to address some of these things. So now we get to jump into what is probably a very significant event. It's the Henry Crete letter. So Henry Crete published Honest to God, and originally it was meant to the leaders in London, but Matthew Walbert, who we think is a great hero, highly encouraged Henry to make this distribution a lot wider. Now, Henry was a leader in at least three that I can think of continents and like 5 different countries. So certainly Canada, US, South Africa, I forget where else in Africa he was, and then UK. So they had seen a wide variety of experiences, and so they were able to speak about this. And I think Aldo Martin also brings this up. He's like, is this the first time somebody has brought criticism about the church? No, but it's the first time a significant leader has brought up criticism, and that's partly why we listened at this point in time. So you can read Honest to God for yourself. It's like 39 pages. There were many criticisms of systematic problems, including legalism, financial misuse. Um, there is a shockwave that happens through the ICOC in the next 3 years, and there's a lot of people who are longtime members who end up leaving, and is kind of very interesting. I think it was definitely the last straw, the straw that broke the camel's back for them. They basically said, well, we've been having problems all along, and we've kind of whatever gone with the flow or whatever, because they say that they're changing. But now Henry Crete's letter exposes it and says it's not just in our congregation, it's pretty much universal. And so a number of churches actually have apology letters, which are later retracted or removed from the websites. I know that at least Boston and Los Angeles have them, and I have copies of both. And then right after the Henry Crete letter, there were some practices that were mitigated. So they said, well, yes, we've been so burdensome with all the meetings. So let's make, midweek optional. Let's make Devo optional. Let's make, other things optional. Let's make family group and discipling optional, and so there were some practices that were mitigated. I think they still asked for a special missions contribution for the last time, and then they were like, okay, well, we'll figure this out. So for some time there was maybe a little bit of a let up with all the demands, and of course along with that, which I'll begin to address, there because the practices were mitigated, some felt like, well, we're just not demanding enough of members these days. Any case, so in the 2003 timeframe, there was beginning to be, no more world sector leaders. So that started happening in this time frame. I know Randy McKean and Steve Johnson were no longer world sector leaders. And also in 2003, so this is a year after the resignation, Kip was given the Portland International Church of Christ. Well, back then it was the Portland whatever congregation, and 3 former members have, Jenny Lynch and Rennie and Gloria have actually written out their stories of what this looks like, and their sense was Russ Ewell needed to rein in Portland, which was slowly bleeding members and was thinking of running off to be more independent, and Kip needed a church, so this was seemingly a good fit. So Kip was basically brought in as the sheriff. And yeah, he was an interesting sheriff, but you can read the story. So immediately with that, Kip writes Revolution Through Restoration 3, and of course, denounces the Henry Crete letter and the happenings in the ICOC, moving towards more autonomy and away from their pyramidal structure. So I think also should note with my first point, sometimes it wasn't just the world sector leaders resigning, it was sometimes they were made to resign. But anyways, we'll move on. Kip actually has an interesting interview in 2004 with the Christian Chronicle, where people in the Christian Chronicle asked him what he believes, and he got to talk about his core conviction, mostly from the writing of the Revolution through Restoration 3, and he was calling ICOC churches to his vision. Basically, he was like, well, I've written this to all the churches, and I expect that they're going to follow. And so we begin to have three factions forming. I wrote this in 2004, and then I updated it in 2005. But there's kind of one group, and there was a very, very small number. Salt Lake City was one of them, where they wanted to make changes and make amends. I also saw, to some degree, Chicago and Triangle doing some of that. So, for example, Triangle actually invited Jim Condon, Sue Condon is his wife, to come back, and they talked a bit, but they didn't change sufficiently, is my general sense. And then a second group, which was, we're gradually changing, and we feel like we're changing sufficiently to deal with problems. And then the third group, as I alluded to earlier, was like, well, we've really watered down our practices, and we're no longer expecting the life of disciples. So some of them didn't want Kip to return. Some of them wanted Kip to return. There's actually, we had on Delphi forums a whole listing of like leaders and churches that were aligning themselves with Kip at this time. So then in 2005, with a sharp decline in repositioning, they have to figure out what they're going to do with themselves. So on the one hand, Kip outright condemns the Henry Crete letter and says, it's misguided. This is causing a lot of problems, and he's continuing to call the ICOC to his vision. In the ICOC, they were kind of like, okay, we're going to figure this out on our own. So they actually had a unity proposal, and you can see a lot of these things they called unity and revival. So things had gotten more autonomous at this point in time, and churches were beginning to become more self-governed, although they a little bit, not fully. There's the old ways of various churches dictating policy still. So then they eventually respond to Kip in this time frame, and actually there's a previous letter that came out from Boston in the August time frame to the rest of the churches talking about Kip, which I'm happy to also provide, but these are the more relevant ones. So the official statement is from on Disciples Today, which is their website, and basically they say, no thanks, but no thanks to Kip. You're spiritually elitist. You've been very prideful. You've done a number of things that they disagree with, and no, we don't want you to be the top leader. So that's what's going on there. So with that, not too surprisingly, in 2006, we'll see the two groups moving away from each other. And with the ICOC, they talked about this unity proposal. So they'll use the terms like 2.0 and 3.0, which is more recent. So 2.0 was kind of more this delegate system and more autonomous, but kind of cooperation, very loose. We'll talk about 3.0 when we get to the current state of affairs. That's only been in like the last 5 years or so. And with the churches and leaders that aligned with Kip, they moved away, and officially, as of October 15th, 2006, in their own writings, that Portland now, and the International Christian Church was established. So Kip's group, they called themselves the Sold Out Discipling Movement, which has an interesting acronym, but they realized it, and they later termed themselves the Sold Out Movement, and also the International Christian Churches. So I copied this out from Upside Down 21, which is the ICC's side. Perhaps most confusing is the persecution towards us from our own fellowship, the International Churches of Christ. And more frustrated disciples are choosing to start new churches rather than split their current congregations. Well, they did split the current congregations, but this is exactly what so many of us agreed to in 1982 when we chose to stop sending campus ministers into the mainline churches of Christ and instead planted new churches. And they started a new movement, and Kip had gone back to Los Angeles, so he called it the Los Angeles International Christian Church. So there you have it. So 2006. So now we can talk about the last 18 years recent happenings. So the ICOC 2.0 as of 2007 was the delegate system. And since then, they've had this whole, cooperation proposal. You can see it on their website, ICOC Co-op. I can give you the links. And churches had to opt in. So, it was not mandatory, but you faced replanting if you didn't. Um, TPI actually closed in 2014, but then Illumination Publishers International started. Over this time, we saw, I think, even as early as 2010, First Principles was restarted, and you can find a number of these apps actually in the App Store. So there's like the East Africa version, there's the Chicago Church, the Boston Church of Christ version. There were actually discipling partners that were reinstated in this time. I had a number of people in the Boston area tell me, oh, yeah, I was assigned a discipling partner. Special missions and projects were reinstated, and, demand for money. So all this stuff that was mitigated for a short time around the Henry Crete letter came back. So this is from their ICOC webs, various YouTubes and websites and things like that. So Kidogo and Anchor Academy. So I found a lot of the stuff previously, and you can find. So they're talking about what do we want it to look like, and this 3.0 C structure. Well, you can turn a pyramid upside down, but it's still a pyramid, and so it's still got like the churches, delegates, and then you have subcommittees and executive team. And you can turn a pyramid sideways, but it's just confusing. On the right-hand side here, so they have some number of churches, and then out of that you get the outer circles like delegates and chairmen or regional families, and then you get regional family of churches, which is a smaller one, and then you get service teams, and then over here I don't know what the far right catalyst team is supposed to be and how this is supposed to be exactly a circle. So let's redraw it. More accurately, it looks like this. So I grabbed it out of the ICOC co-op sites, and so now there's about 750 ICOC churches, and each of them has been governed by evangelist elders and whatever board of directors, and can vary a little bit. And then you got certain pillar churches still in effect. So certain key metropolises kind of govern others, and then out of that there's an overlap with the delegates. So there were at one point about 160 delegates, that might be increasing, and then they report in to people that tend to be in this top blue section, the Catalyst team, including the regional family chairman and women's chairs. And in addition to that, there's 2 teachers, an elder, a couple of women's ministry leaders, and somebody from the missions co-op task force. And then there's this group of service teams that's supposed to advise. So if you're an ecclesiologist, it went from a pyramid to this is a little bit more what's called synodal or conciliar. So it's much more like a Presbyterian, or another parallel you can use is like the U.S. government with all the committees. So, but synodal or pyramidal it's still sort of pyramidal. It's just not got like a top leader, and there's all these teams that are also involved. Right. So in recent years, the last 4 or 5 years, even before the pandemic, there was some efforts to talk nicely with the mainline churches of Christ in Abilene, and also other places, the Common Grounds efforts. So Gordon Ferguson, Doug Jacoby, Nick Zola started some of these talks, and they have their presentations. You can find a lot of the materials online on YouTube about their presentations. I know I jokingly and snarkily mentioned it's like, the sentiment was, yeah, ignore that Kip called you spiritually dead and we stole your people in churches. But you people, you mainline churches of people also had a role in that divide. And so anyways, that's kind of the sentiment coming out of that. I know that they're also talking with other Churches of Christ organizations, primarily like in renew.org and things like that. Uh, in 2002, Stephen Lisa Johnson had been coming up with a different than their mainstream teachings in terms of allowing women who are gifted to be able to teach in front of men. So they called this mutuality, and it's their brand of egalitarianism, I guess. So, you know, eventually Portland was disfellowshipped and removed out of Disciples Today, so it's no longer on their church list. And I think the best analogy that we came up with, because they were like, oh yeah, you can come to regional gatherings and whatever committee meetings and things like that. You just can't be teaching, and we're no longer recognizing you as a church. So the best analogy that we have is, well, you've been removed from the team and now you sit in the first row of fans or something like that. So the ICOC is still discussing the role of women. Uh, Also in 2002, so this is December 30th, the Friday before the new year, the ICOC and ICC lawsuits were filed. And what to mention here is that this was unreported sexual abuse, including of minors as well as those of in the age of majority. And those are continuing. They're progressing, and I believe a number of them are in discovery phase at this point. Uh, and I've heard that there might be even depositions might be taken. They are talking with a guy named Marty Solomon. He's been pretty influential. Some of the mainline Churches of Christ have also talked about fractures and multiple subcultures, and maybe suggesting that the ICOC is no more. But yet we see, websites like Disciples Today and the ICOC Co-op websites and things like that. So I'm not sure that I can fully believe that it's no more. We'll switch gears a little bit to the ICC. So as we said, in 2006, the International Christian Churches were established. And so Kip went from Portland to Los Angeles. And actually, kind of shockingly, Portland actually reverted back to the ICOC when he left. It was a big bone of contention, and Steve Johnson and Kip are not talking anymore. In the ICC, they've projected a number of plantings, and that's in their Crown of Thorns projects. We can see certainly they plan to plant in the United States, where they have it titled Operation Eagle, and then they have other fancy names for other projects. They do have first principles that they've reestablished. They have their own version. Actually, ironically, the International Churches of Christ was using the ICC version for a number of years. And then they doubled down on a number of their distinctives. So special missions contribution went up to twice a year, and I guess in the recent years it's up to 3 times a year. I have a note from Los Angeles here on the right. It's like where they are, let's just say, it's not optional. So they basically are told what to give. And so as I said in this second bullet point here, the members are told what to give. And, for a time, the ICC websites actually had budget worksheets and contribution forms, which you could download and print out and supply. And then they have also emphasized on their distinctive of central leadership, as in a pyramidal structure, and it's a bit of a polemic against autonomy. Other core convictions that they mention, they talk about, well, we're a Bible church and we're not just a New Testament church. And I think that's kind of a bit against the mainline Churches of Christ, sorry. And then there's, they talk about be silent where the Bible speaks and speak where the Bible is silent. So is that, well, first of all, from the first point, is it all the Bible or is it cherry picked? Like, there's some passages about the king of Israel in, Deuteronomy 17 verses 14 and following, where even the king of Israel is not supposed to multiply treasures, not supposed to multiply wives. He's supposed to go out and write a book of the law for himself. So, it's interesting. I don't see Kip doing those things. He's certainly multiplying treasures, and I don't know about wives, but whatever. Maybe interns, pictures of interns. And he's not writing a book of the law. And the be silent where the Bible speaks, speak where the Bible is silent. It's kind of, we've translated to we dare to elevate our opinions on matters to commands, and we cherry pick the Bible, and where it doesn't explicitly teach on the matter, and we'll let our interpretation of Scripture be above questioning, disputation, or discussion. So ixnay on disagreeing with us, and we'll tell you what to do. Discipling is not optional, and it's thus very specifically the 1-over-1 discipling, and they still want to commit themselves to evangelism of this world in this generation. In 2008, they established Mercy Worldwide. 2012, they have their own higher educational institution, which is supposedly accredited to give degrees. August 2012 is the ICCM, the International College of Christian Ministry. And of course, immediately Kip awards himself a doctorate, the Doctorate of Ministry, based on previous writings and his entire life of works. Okay, and then of course, 2012, as with the ICOC, there's the lawsuits that have been filed. And very recent happenings, so just the last 6 weeks, Raul Moreno came up with a letter, which I have on the right here, that Kip McKean has resigned, effective immediately. I guess he's announcing it. And he cites something about he has faltered spiritually. So the link that I have here is Colton Roan's explanation. And there, as I alluded to, there were some things that made Kip a liability. So he was told he's stepping down. And in the last few weeks, we've seen also Ron Harding, who is the panegyrist, the guy who can say nothing wrong about, Kip has done nothing wrong, that is, and that Kip has only done good things and is a blessing to the world. He's actually no longer the cyber evangelist. So there's a new cyber evangelist these days. So anyways, that's what's going on. So other information. So about 15 years ago, I did a paper to kind of revisit what's going on, the good, the bad, the ugly, and also what I learned. Michael Potts did a paper in 2011 looking at Kip's effect on his theology, and is still in, Cincinnati is not one of the top cities in the ICOC. So it was interesting that, a lot of his doctrine was still being promulgated. And then 10 years after the Henry Crete letter, Michael did Enjoy the Silence. 20 years after the Henry Crete letter, It's No Good. And I mentioned one last thing, which is the Spacemakers podcast. So these guys were all ICOC members. They wanted to improve the church. They tended to be post-millennials, and they were relatively young people who, had idealism about how to improve the ICOC. They started their podcast right after the pandemic. They were all remote anyways and virtual, so they said, "Oh, let's start a dialogue with many different people from even multiple countries and try to see where we can go with this." Their last episode was a few months ago, March 4th, 2024. And what's interesting that they concluded was that the system, the ICOC, resists change, so they cannot change it. So it's kind of, the last major piece of news that I have, and that's what I have. So hopefully I've done it in about 62 minutes. I will look at the questions and comments at this time. So I know I've addressed some of them. So yeah, some of them is in the discipling dilemma. Prayer partners, were they in a thing in the rest of the churches of Christ? I don't think it was as prevalent in the rest of the churches of Christ. It did come out of Crossroads as a distinctive. Let's see, pillar churches. Yes, it was 1981 that came out of Kip's writings. Yes, there was an opt-in or face replanting in terms of in the recent turn of events in the last 20 years. Yes, the International Church of Christ has kind of said, like, oh, we're having this co-op agreement. Yes, you can choose to opt into our movement, but if you don't, we'll send out a new group of people. We'll replant you. So, anyways, and I think those are all the comments that I've had. So I'll stop the live stream for now, and I'll edit the video, and that will be it. Thank you so much for coming, and hope you enjoyed this.